disclaimer! On the other one, you bastard!
Brought to you by supporters who probably have better taste than this schmuck.
Third-party Legends never remains in a static position. Things always ebb and flow, with some companies taking center stage while others fall from grace. Sure, some companies win for a time, but as the ancient Time Lord proclaims, nobody wins for long. As such, let's go back a year to mid-2021. New Age is leading the charge with its constant output of top-tier figures, and although some releases allude to a dip in quality, they are poised to reassure everyone of their pedigree. Iron Factory enters a transitionary position, and nobody truly knows the future of the company. Some even argue this is still the case. And then we have Magic Square, whose output can be likened to an old lawnmower, failing to start over and over again. Fiddly releases like Cosmos, fiddly and ugly releases like Blue Streak, and horrendous releases like Megatron, it's getting old real fast. And yet, oddly enough, they still have their die-hard fans, showing fanatic devotion, the likes of which would make fans' toys blush. If the Guardians of the Fans Toys order can brainwash a tick into my speech pattern, I shudder to think what Magic Square obsessors can do. Regardless, things aren't looking good. For many people like myself, it's Magic Square's last chance to impress. This is where Menasor comes in. Announced around the time of the company's inception, many people assumed this would never see the light of day, perpetually trapped in production hell. Right off the bat, things weren't appearing promising. First, there was the designer, rumored to be the same person who tackled Unique Toys, Bruticus. A fitting choice, given Magic Square is essentially Unique Toys. But there was one small problem. People hated Unique Toys Bruticus. From what I can gather, complaints stemmed from a change in aesthetic halfway through the combiner, leading to a sort of mismatched look, and a somewhat antiquated form of engineering. On top of this, there was a lot of confusion surrounding how the combiner would be handled. The prototype seems to randomly flip-flop between aesthetics, and it wasn't clear if we'd be getting two versions of Murder Master to offer different homages. Well, I'm sure it was clear to anyone who could read Chinese, but most of the Western fanbase, myself included, cannot, and Magic Square doesn't exactly lay things out well for their Western fans like New Age does. And then there was the baggage from the previous releases. It was right after Megatron, who can blame people for being concerned. Due to these factors, Magic Square was in a precarious position. They needed a hit, not just a regular solid release, but something bold that would blow expectations out of the water. All eyes were focused on this release. It all came down to a single moment. Greetings, Cybertronians. I'm DrLockdown, and today's diagnosis commences a 4-part series. Welcome to Menasor. For the first installment, we examine the first set on the long road to Menasor. MS-B14 beat back and MS-B15 collide. Honestly, I don't know which name applies to which, since both are synonyms of breakdown, so I'ma just call them Breakdown and Wildrider like any sane person would. Now, typically when it comes to Magic Square, vehicle modes aren't the problem. Not to say they can't be at all, as seen with half-melted Blue Streak and the wonky copy of the New Age version that was Bumblebee, but typically they're passable at worst. Wildrider and Breakdown follow this trend, turning into pretty sleek sports cars that carry their G1 DNA quite well. Starting off with Breakdown, he exhibits his Countach likeness pretty effectively. Sure, the top is a little more rounded compared to the real thing, but I assume that's part of the downscale process to get it working at such a scale. Also, I don't think anyone who's a fan of this scale is going to complain that much. Right off the bat, you'll notice that compared to a lot of figures his size, he's got quite the high level of paint. In fact, not to throw shade at the other members, but he's easily one of the best painted vehicles in the set. Second really only to Dragstrip. The blue trim at the bottom really catches your eye, popping very well. It's nice and continuous, never falling into the trappings of usual segmentations. Also, great job with the red part at the front. Pops pretty damn well and doesn't feel wispy. Doesn't matter which toy I'm discussing, if it does red or yellow paint well, I'm drawing attention to it. Shit's hard, y'all. You seen what some examples look like? The sculpting is also pretty crisp too, with lots of line work picking out the vehicle detail. That said, as commendable as this is, I'm not too excited by it considering 1, Unique Toys is known for their line work, and 2, this isn't the first Lamborghini the company has done. Hell, it isn't even the first Legends Lamborghini they've done. I will give credit to the paint though. It picks out quite a few places. Curiously, the back is actually a different shade to all of the windows. Not sure why, it uses the same paint Wildrider's torso uses instead. Bit weird. Also disappointed the handles haven't been picked out, especially when Sideswipe got this right years prior, but ah well, really it's a minor thing given how much paint they've slathered over everything else. And that's really how I feel about most of Breakdown's issues. They're there, but they're pretty inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. For example, due to how he transforms, there's a smidge of blue bleed around the roof of the car. Firstly though, the sign, and second, they've had the foresight not to paint the bottoms of the feet. I've seen figures 3 times the price f this up, even with worse colors too. So kudos to figuring this out properly from the get-go. I've also seen people lament the lack of paint on the headlights, and while it is a little sad, they've at least gone to the trouble of doing the taillights. And personally, I would have preferred they used the same black paint from the back for the windows as well, since I'm not the biggest fan of this gunmetal. I'd also prefer them to have gone with a more accurate shade of cream, one seen on both the Toon and Toy, since this off-white seems a little bit generic. Ultimately though, it doesn't really matter. It's a cool little Countach, coming in at a decent size and with wonderful rolling capabilities thanks to the use of pinned wheels. In fact, all of these figures roll well with their pinned wheels. Although I suppose that's not saying much given third party tends to use pinned wheels anyway. Guess I'm just getting used to the Hasbro stuff lately. Unfortunately, by comparison, Wildrider doesn't quite carry the same pedigree. He's still a pretty good figure, no doubt, but there are definitely issues to see here. In car mode, despite using much of the same engineering as Breakdown, he feels a lot flatter. Examining him next to the original Toy and photos of the real Ferrari 308 GTB, you can see they f***ed with the proportions a bit. Perhaps it's for the combined proportions, or perhaps it's out of fear of angering Ferrari at some point. I mean, even Hasbro demonstrated that fear. They're willing to play chicken with Porsche, but when Dino comes along, they deviate hard from the source material. Although that said, they seem to have gotten a little bolder with the legacy version of Wildrider. It's ironically much closer proportionally than the supposed free of copyright third-party release, albeit with a lot of extra stylized detail to mask it up. This is actually why I prefer the legacy version over the Magic Square one, at least in this mode, alongside the luscious clear windows. But this isn't a review of Legacy Many, so I should probably stop getting off topic. When it comes to this review's subject, I don't know, whatever the reason, it doesn't bother me that much. I'm not an accuracy nut, I'm just pointing out for those who might be. For me, it's just, this car doesn't look as good as Breakdown. Probably the weakest car of the set, although he does have his positives. The red windows pop hella hard, and the dark grey is incredibly rich. Lots of crisp details too. The line work doesn't appear in extremely high quantities, but it does its job pretty well. I'd even say better than Breakdown. They also went to the trouble of painting both the head and tail lights this time, in 3 different colors no less. Love to see it. Actually, come to think of it, maybe the reason Breakdown didn't have any was because it's on top of blue, and yellow is a notoriously hard color to do. Either way, it's definitely a plus over him. That said, one major issue ultimately makes me consider this inferior. Paint chipping. Really bad paint chipping. This figure uses 2 shades of red, a glossier one for the windows and a matte one for the bottom. The matte red is the same one used for the hood on Breakdown, and while it sticks to the plastic properly there, it flakes off like a motherfucker here. Why they didn't just use the same red for everything baffles me, since there's barely any difference between the two. Only psychopaths like myself who overanalyze the shit out of everything would even think to look. This is actually one of the reasons why you might prefer the KO over the original, mind you. According to a friend of mine who owns the bootleg, who has kindly let me take footage for this and other reviews, and that toy guy, there isn't any paint chipping present on that version. I'm sure if I really wanted to, I could go in and fix it, but I really shouldn't have to. It's not the only case of paint chipping on the figure, but it's easily the worst. However, I think I can ultimately be less harsh on this figure, as well as Breakdown to a lesser extent, for one specific reason. They actually listened to fan feedback on this one. From the very beginning, what's the one issue that has plagued every release from Magic Square? Whether their figures have been good, bad, or just plain f*** right off, what's the consistent factor that keeps them from being on the same level as other companies? It's simple. Plastic quality. Consistently, they've used this wibbly-wobbly soft plastic that makes all the details feel soft and gives the figures an unprofessional feel. It also has the side effect of making any finishes they try to add look utterly horrendous. The Stunticons are the first figures in their lineup to actually take this criticism to heart and provide some nice, dense, professional plastic. It still isn't the best plastic on the market, but I can actually transform these without them constantly feeling icky. Right off the bat, this was the first thing that stood out to me. Years and years of complaining about it, and they've done absolutely nothing. Until now. Maybe it took them so long to fix this because their die-hard fans don't seem to care, or rather, they've become so used to it that they now consider it a positive. I don't get that. Annoyingly, it seems like the releases after this have gone right back to the style they've used before, along with other issues their previous figures have had. Everyone praised the plastic quality on Soundwave, but surprise, it's just as shit as it was before. But whatever, we're here to discuss these figures, and even with all their faults, I'm really happy they took on feedback just this once. Whether it was for the sake of the combined mode, or because for a brief moment they realized the error of their ways, hats off to them. Anyway, size-wise, there isn't much difference between Wildrider and Breakdown. They work work really well together, which is a good thing because they're going to become the legs later. And bringing in the upscaled versions for comparisons, these things will really piss off scale nuts. They don't really fit in with anything, not even Legends Plus like the Figures Make Fans toys puts out. You're only really buying these if you just want to sample the combiner at a cheaper price and don't care about scale with anything. Also, just note that there are differences between the paint applications on Breakdown. They kinda cheaped down on the bootlegs, which is pretty disappointing. Still, you'll see why they did this with some budget reallocation later. Also, side note, the KOs I'm showing comparisons with in this video are the oversized, no-brand ones, under the BW code, whatever that means. At the time of writing, this was the only knockoff on the market. Since then, however, another has been announced, under the name of MHZ Toys Tiger Wing. I could be mistaken, but this appears to be a 1-to-1 KO with no change in size. Just putting that out there, you might want to do some research in a few months when it releases. Doubt anyone I know will get it though, so I don't think I'll be able to assist in any way. But with all that said, the most surprising thing wasn't anything to do with the vehicle modes. It wasn't anything to do with the plastic either, oh no. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to present to you the moment I was sold on this set. Let us engage in the transformation. Now, the first time you go through a transformation like this, it's not going to seem very interesting. I mean, it's pretty simple, it treads very similar ground to what you've seen before. In fact, it borrows a lot of engineering from the sideswipe they did ages ago, which makes sense because Countach and Countach. But fear not, it is going to make a lot more sense in context. Might be unassuming now, but we'll get to why these transformations are important in a little bit. That being said, given the transformations are very similar between the two, I'm basically just going to show it once with a few differences between them. There's no real reason going through the same transformation twice, so to cut down on time, I'm just going to go through it once. So the first thing you want to do is just wiggle everything in the middle section free so you got a bit of clearance. You basically just separate out these leg parts and rotate them down like so. This middle section pulls out and down. Yes, it's a sliding rail, but because of the way this clips in, it's not too bad. Straighten up the feet like that, and then there are dedicated slots that the side panels tab into, and that's what makes everything nice and solid, so the sliding rails are actually being supported by something. Anywho, separate the legs like so. Take the hood of the car and fold it down onto the backpack. Open up this back section there, and a little something to note with my copy, because it's second hand, the person I bought it off already broke part of it. Apparently these tabs have a tendency to break if you try to pull out the arms first, so don't forget to pull this section back before messing with the arms like that. Anywho, on the topic of the arms, they rotate down and rotate down. They are on double hinges like that, and that makes the whole thing proportioned better. Come into the back and bring out the head and rotate it forward like so. And now those tabs will plug into the slots where the mushroom pegs are instead of the original slots. The last step for both of them is just to pull the arms down like so. And then Wildrider deviates just a little bit. You want to rotate the waist around. That's not part of Breakdown's transformation. And of course the feet rotate the other way, and there is now an extra little toe piece out of there. And once that's done, it's all good. So yes, the transformations on paper do seem pretty unassuming. I mean, we've got the same legs as Sideswipe and just really simple arms. What is there to talk about? Not much, aside from the fact that Wildrider's head is a little bit difficult to get out, but it's not too hateful. So yeah, it doesn't seem like there's a lot to discuss. However, that is in a vacuum. To understand these conversions more clearly, we're going to have to examine these figures in the context of everything Magic Square have released. Sideswipe, solid start. Has its issues, but shows the company is capable. Magnus, honestly great aside from paint chipping issues. So far, my second favorite Magic Square release. Trailbreaker, pretty well engineered, but things are getting wibblier. Artfire, and by extension the other versions. Off the deep end at this point. F this thing. Cosmos, very wibbly and not fun to play with. Blue Streak, horrendous transformation and looks disgusting with its gloss finish. This thing. Huffer, surprisingly great. Sea Spray and Beachcomber, the latter is pretty good, but the former has the same wibbly transformation. Optimus Prime, alright, but way too complex for the size. Also, they tried to beat New Age to the market with the Magnus upgrade, and it turns out horribly. It makes no sense too, they already made a fantastic version. There was just no need for this to exist. Cyclonus, basically unfinished, not just in engineering, but also in alt mode. This thing. Blaster, alright, but really finicky for the size. Bumblebee, literally a worse version of the New Age one. Why would anyone want this? Oh, and also way too finicky for the size. Megatron, this thing. Anally, painfully, without consent, or protection. See the problem here? Of the 14 molds I have sampled from them, at least leading up to the release of Menasor, 9 of them have had engineering issues of some sort. They started out really well, but over the course of 3 years, they have slowly but surely devolved into overcomplicated bullshit transformations, even on releases that can be considered good figures. As I have discussed in previous videos, this entire approach is antithetical to what Legends represents. Small figures designed primarily for play sessions. Accuracy doesn't necessarily correlate with bad transformations. New Age has delivered on both factors with every single release of theirs bar one. Hell, even Magic Square started out really good, so it is possible for them to do better. This release proves that they can rise above their idiotic engineering ideologies and deliver something truly inspiring. It's entirely possible it's just so the combined mode is lighter and consequently easier to pose. It's also possible it's because this is an older design, given it's been in production since the DX9 Unique Toys split. This thing has been in the oven for a damn long time. Whatever the case though, the engineering brought me right back to a better time when both competing companies had potential. The transformations on their own aren't anything beyond solid, but in the context of everything else, they are what I've wanted for a very long time. And the end results are ultimately pretty good too. Granted, when you're not trying to force in a Scramble City gimmick, these two are always pretty easy to design, but they've done a good job regardless. Starting off with Breakdown, he's looking damn snazzy. Once again, I would have liked to have seen him in his old custard looking colors, but for what we have, he's damn nice. First thing I noticed when seeing him initially was the head sculpt. It's actually good. Magic Square has always been hit or miss with their faces, so it's good to see something that actually looks, well, decent. Although perhaps that's a little excessive for praise, given traditionally Scramble City heads are pretty easy to do, given they're essentially based on what amounts to combiner ports.
Look, yo, we're not here to peg your bald fat ass. Just give us our payment.
You were gonna peg my ass as hard
No
as
way,
possibly can.
that's for you and your MILF to do.
Oh man, think he wants to peg
For the
me.
last time, I don't want to see your ass get
Moving down to the chest, it's definitely pretty simple, but it gets the design across pretty well. The midriff section is a little bit thinner than the original, likely a mix of stylization, decisions, and sacrifices to make the combined pegs fit properly, but it's still pretty neat. The arms are fairly simple with minimal detail, but the leftover paint from the vehicle mode adds some nice breakup not present on the Sunbow model. Also on the topic, they've hilariously molded in the tiny rivets present on the original knees. It's something you'll likely never notice unless you're scrutinizing it. I wouldn't care if they left it off, to be honest, but I still find this hilariously charming. Kinda glad they fixed the proportions on the waist though. No more diapers, thank you. Moving down to the legs, Christ, these go hard. They've engineered it so the car chassis slightly angles backwards, and created the perfect balance of integration and stylization. They've also taken the vent detail and added lovely 3D effects to it. This design builds exceptionally well off the Sunbow base, never being afraid to deviate to make the robot mode look more cohesive. You just know if this were one of their other standalone releases, they would have added a billion panels to cover things up. You really don't need it, you just need vision. This figure definitely has that. Also, the insides of the legs have extra black paint for no reason at all. F me, talk about unnecessary awesomeness. Wildrider has it too, but it really pops here especially. Ultimately, there isn't a single thing I can find fault with here. It's not the most amazing thing I've ever seen, but I just can't find anything to complain about. The backpack cleans up well, the bits all block themselves out well, the sculpt accentuates the posing so the dynamic poses actually feel dynamic. Looking at you, Legacy! There just isn't anything I can get angry at. Yes, spits aren't 100% accuracy, but 1, accuracy is an aesthetic choice, not a positive or a negative, and 2, hello overused editing assets. If you're the kind of person who considers lack of flaws the marker of a top tier figure, this may just be one of the best Legends figures on the market. Personally, I prefer a figure to go above and beyond in other areas, even if it means it'll have flaws in the end. But if that's the way you deal with figures, then this should be right up your alley. Even the articulation works flawlessly. At this size, there isn't really anything I would add. Waist and abs, got everything you could want. Foot posability for dynamic posing, it's all there. I know some snarky little f will complain he doesn't have a butterfly joint, but at this size I don't really think it's possible. And another thing, you know how a lot of Magic Square's releases use those really awful pegs to allow rotation, meaning you can pull off and lose the head and wrists? Not a thing here, fully engineered mushroom and ball joints. It's always been this easy, it's just that up until now this company has been stupid. Unfortunately, a bit of that stupidity creeps back in with Wildrider. Once again, he's by no means a bad figure, but there are definitely issues on show. Fortunately, most of the positives carry over too though. The head sculpt is also great, perhaps even better than Breakdown's. The backpack pack cleans up pretty well, at least better than the recently released Legacy version. Although to be fair, that figure is a different beast, having to fold up in a much more unique way. Also, most of the stock photos are lying, he can fold it up much more cleanly. But back to the Magic Square version, a lot of the paint has been allocated to the arms, going for the toon look. Love how these pop, and I love the extra mechanical details the elbows both have. And on the topic of hidden details, the knees repeat the same idea, harking back to the toon model. Again, hilariously charming. Unfortunately, this is where we start getting into the weaker than Breakdown territory. This figure sadly just doesn't exude the same presence as his partner. For starters, the torso has had its proportions changed, most likely for the purpose of keeping the combined mode functional. I'm all for necessary changes at the size like this, but they haven't thought through how to mitigate the consequences. As a result of this change, more attention has been brought to the midriff, and it's boring as shit. Yes, it's accurate to the original, but two things. First, they've already made changes with the torso design, and they should have made alterations to compensate. And two, personally, I just think they should have been more open to altering the design for the sake of visual cohesion. You may disagree with me on this, but it's how I see it. Plus, we're going to see in the coming weeks that Magic Square is perfectly willing to make changes, so ultimately, it's not a fault of the accuracy, but rather a fault of tunnel vision. Not as bad as the legs, though. These are a bit of a snooze fest. This one I kinda get, though. These bits form the back of the car, so I get that they can't go crazy on the detail. Breakdown's legs end up on the underside of the alt mode, so they can go as nuts as they want, but Wildriders are in full view, so any changes they make need to be subtle. In this case though, why not incorporate some of the venting detail from the original car? Why not develop a nice balance between the two? That's not my biggest gripe though. No, that would be the paint chipping. And it's not just the stuff left over from the vehicle mode. Because of the way the combiner pegs are inserted, paint chipping is inevitable. Doesn't matter how durable the paint is, this is just the way it was designed. A solution for this would be to use the off-white plastic from Breakdown, if they were already going to change the shade at least. But alas, it's grey with an off-white coating, and it sucks that it eventually ends up like this. Also, side note, this little piece of mechanical detail looks cool, but I have no idea what it represents. Somebody please explain this in the comments, because it isn't present on the toon or toy.
It's driving me crazy!
But yes, this figure has issues. When placed next to Breakdown, you can tell he's the weakest part of the set. I also personally find him inferior to the Legacy version in this mode, simply because the stylization really gives him some extra character. I know the small chest and vented shoulders aren't purposeful stylization, but rather a side effect of the combination gimmick, but the end result is way more up my alley. Transformation is inferior though, feels a bit finicky despite being the old Combiner Wars dead-end system mostly. That said, in a vacuum, he is still pretty decent. You can tell they've put a good amount of thought into how he works, even if he's just following the template in the end. I mean, he retains all the articulation the Breakdown had, and you can still get him in some great poses that feel dynamic enough. And this is without the accessories too. For some weird reason, I can't seem to find the guns they come with. Happening quite a bit lately, I'm getting somewhat concerned. Still, I can at least show you what the bootleg accessories look like, given the comparison shots, so here's how that works. And in the context of most previous Magic Square releases, oh boy, he comes out strong. He's simply a mid-tier Legends release, packed alongside a damn fine Legends release. It's a solid start to a Combiner, which in this scale is something we haven't really experienced all that often. Anywho, before we finish up, quick sizing. Again, basic Legends size. Not much to say here. And once again, bringing in the upscaled versions, you can see that scale just doesn't work. I know a lot of people will be wanting to use these instead of the upcoming Legacy ones, but heads up, it really doesn't work. The scale is way off no matter which way you slice it. Unless maybe you want to go for G1 toy scale. I don't give a flying f about scale personally, but if I did, I'd probably skip this set. Also, neat little trick here. The upscale uses the money saved from the paint on the vehicle mode to offer two separate pieces of plastic on the feet, instead of the paint system the original had. This means far less paint bleed in vehicle mode, which is a nice touch. Unfortunately, bootleg Breakdown also got saddled with a wonky arm, so there's that. If you're going to buy the upscaled version, you have to understand, this is a knockoff. You're paying less, so quality control is going to be wonky. Even the best companies were saddled with issues like this. It just comes with the territory, and if you're okay with sacrificing QC for price, then go right ahead. Just be aware this is a mileage may vary type of situation. Yours may be perfect, yours may be an unplayable piece of garbage. Make sure you order from a reputable seller with good buyer protection if you're going to go down this route, as you would for any KO. I'ma be honest, I wasn't expecting this release to be that great. Given the immense amount of bullshit contextual baggage, I wasn't planning on getting this set day one. I was going to wait for these to hit the aftermarket on the cheap, maybe a year down the track. Magic Square figures often do this, especially when new age versions release. This is actually what I'm hoping to do with their Devastator eventually. Yeah, I wonder how that's gonna turn out, given most people claim it's a mess. Either way, it wasn't until I saw these in person that I finally saw the hype. A friend of mine was getting into Legends after seeing the collection I had, but in time he began to realize it just wasn't for him. As such, he gave up on this release and decided to sell these on the cheap. I ended up paying just over deluxe price for these 2 on a whim after messing with them at his former house. The moment I laid my fingers upon these masterful pieces of plastic, I was enthralled. All my reservations about jumping in faded away in an instant. I transferred him the money almost instantly, and that very same night I pre-ordered the other members. This set may not be the greatest Legends release on the planet, but it ignited a passion in me that I hadn't felt in a while at the time. Magic Square can do solid releases, and this release proves that. Ultimately, you've got a solid figure teetering on a 5 out of 5 and a decent figure sitting at a 3. That sounds like a damn fine set either way, combined score or no. And here's the thing, it's not the end here. This is merely the first release of a greater lineup. This is just the beginning, and if this is how the set begins, imagine what the rest of the set could be like. But as always, fandom public consciousness is a conversation, so drop your opinion on the state of Magic Square below. Have you always been as disappointed as I have? Have you been hesitant to buy these due to contextual reasons? After all, as always, there's a context for everything. See y'all next week for part 2.